Bene, buonasera a tutti. Innanzitutto voglio ringraziare per l'invito a partecipare a questo convegno da parte del coordinamento scientifico i professori Giannini e Sangalli. Ringrazio particolarmente non tanto per la mia persona quanto per l'istituzione che rappresento, la Pontificia Università Gregoriana. Questa mattina in un incontro con il padre rettore ho comunicato di questa mia presenza, è stato molto contento e mi ha pregato di portare a tutti voi i suoi saluti, cosa che faccio con molto piacere. È infatti un tema storiografico importante anche per la nostra università, soprattutto per la presenza di sacerdoti dall'Europa ma anche da tutto il mondo, oltre che da una parte consistente dei laici, e quindi ringrazio ancora per l'invito. Professor Klueting, thank you very much for your presence in the international seminar. You are welcome. Il professor Klueting insegna all'Università di Colonia in Germania e di Friburgo in Svizzera. Si è specializzato in storia delle religioni, è noto nell'ambiente accademico, è uno specialista dell'area tedesca, ci sono molte sue pubblicazioni, poche però purtroppo sono state tradotte in italiano. Recentemente ha anche recensito il volume Anticattolicesimo, Germania e Italia ai tempi del Kulturkampf europei di Borutta, uscito nel 2010. È un esperto dunque dell'area tedesca e con il suo intervento iniziale andiamo un po' nel cuore degli equilibri europei, esattamente nel 1780 con la soppressione da parte di Giuseppe II dei Kloster in Austria. Ecco, Giuseppe II, ricordiamo, ma aveva già accennato il professor Sangalli, idee fisiocratiche, illuministiche, il famoso editto di tolleranza, il programma febroniano soprattutto, e anche voglio ricordare l'inutile viaggio di Pio VI a Vienna, quindi per muovere un pontefice significa che effettivamente il problema era molto molto acuto. L'altra parte della relazione, proprio in quest'ottica comparativa, riguarderà principalmente le secolarizzazioni dei principati ecclesiastici in Germania all'inizio dell'Ottocento, che poi favoriranno la nascita della Confederazione del Reno e poi anche la fine del Sacro Romano Impero. Un confronto certamente vivace tra queste due realtà che ci prepariamo ora ad ascoltare con vivo interesse. And now with the pleasure I give you a word for your relation. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Lovison. Dear ladies and gentlemen, studying secularization, in which was the Holy Roman Empire, and Josephinism in Austria since the early 1980s. I'm very thankful for your kind invitation to give a paper on this conference. I think the only person from Germany in this wonderful room. Let me start with the question, what is secularization? Secularization, a moment please, unfortunately I do not speak Italian because I was thinking that you will understand me better than I speak English. I'm going to speak English and not German. Excuse me, please. As a first, what is secularization? Secularization, in a narrower sense, is expropriation of ecclesiastical property, especially expropriation by secular powers like secular rulers or princes or by the state, in particular without the consent of a pope, but with the aim to turn the ecclesiastical property more or less to secular utilization. Secularization in a wider sense is profanation or desacralization of politics and society, law and culture. In German, we can distinguish between Säkularisation for secularization in this narrower sense and Säkularisierung for secularization in the wider sense. In the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church, secularization means that a member of the regular clergy becomes a member of the secular clergy or a secular priest. I would like to speak only about secularization as expropriation of ecclesiastical property. Property can be landed property, buildings, areas of arable land, forests, farms, or real property like libraries, archives, or works of art like paintings, or really money, cash assets, capital assets, outstanding debts, income from interests, interest claims, etc. Property can also be privileges and rights, the claim to power, rights of rule over peasants, or political rights to rule over territories with its people. Long before the 18th century, there were many cases of secularization. In the context of the 16th century Protestant Reformation, many Protestant princes in Germany abolished the cloisters in their territories and expropriated the property of the monasteries. For instance, 1527 in the Landgraviate of Hesse under Landgrave Philipp, in the Brunswick principalities of Lower Saxony, in East Frisia, Mecklenburg, Pomerania, or in the Duchy of Württemberg. In England, King Henry VIII abolished the cloisters and monasteries in 1535. In Zwingli's Zurich and in its Swiss surrounding, all cloisters were suppressed in 1524. In the 16th century German Protestant principalities, a large quantity of the property of the abolished cloisters was used for the salary of Protestant pastors, for the assistance of the poor and the sick, or for education and general welfare. In 1527, Philip of Hesse founded the Protestant University of Marburg and some public hospitals by the property of abolished cloisters. In some cases, the property of the former monasteries kept a separate property of the princes, respectively for the state till today. This is a difference between the suppressions of cloisters in 16th century Protestant Germany and the secularization of 1803. But considerable parts of church property were incorporated in the domain of the prince and the dynasty, also in the 16th century, and used for the prince's household, for the administration, or for the military. There is no doubt that this was real secularization of ecclesiastical property. In the 16th century, we can also find the secularization of ecclesiastical territories or ecclesiastical principalities. In 1525, the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, Albrecht of Brandenburg, an ecclesiastical prince, went to Protestantism, which penetrated in these days Prussia, the state of the Teutonic Order at the Baltic Sea. Albrecht proclaimed himself hereditary Duke of Prussia and the ecclesiastical principality of the Teutonic Order a secular duchy. The Peace of Westphalia, by which the 30 Years' War was brought to an end in 1648, resulted in the secularization of ecclesiastical principalities. ecclesiastical principalities which were penetrated by Protestantism and under the rule of Protestant administrators. By the Peace of Westphalia, the Archbishopric of Bremen and the Bishopric of Verden were given as secular duchies to Sweden. The Elector of Brandenburg received the bishoprics of Halberstadt, Minden and Camin, and the reversion of the Archbishopric of Magdeburg, which came to him on the death of the last administrator in 1680. The Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin got the bishoprics of Ratzeburg and Schwerin. The Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel received the Prince Abbacy of Hersfeld, and the Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg the Prince Abbacy of Walkenried. During the deliberations for the Peace of Westphalia, in the year 1646, the term secularization in Latin was used by Henri Duc d'Orléans, Duc de Longueville, envoy principal of King Louis XIV of France for the first time. The Peace of Westphalia created the secularization of ecclesiastical principalities as compensation for the cession of territories. In Latin, pro equivalente autem recompensatione. Compensation as a motivation for secularization returned as a conception of law for secularization with the Peace of Lunéville in 1801, in French, dédommagement, and with the secularization in Germany of 1803. But there was no idea of compensation by the suppression of cloisters in Joseph II's Austrian monarchy. Second, the suppression of cloisters in Joseph II's Austria in the 1780s. Josephinism was not only church reform, but church reform was essential for that what we can also call the Theresian and Josephinist reform, or Theresian and Josephinist reform absolutism. This special Austrian form for the European Enlightenment and of so-called enlightened absolutism was not restricted to the reign of Joseph II since the age of Charles VI, and in particular under Maria Theresa since the tax reform, this special Austrian form of the European Enlightenment and of so-called enlightened absolutism was not restricted to the reign of Joseph II in the Austrian monarchy from 1780 to 1790. There was Josephinism before Joseph II since the age of Charles VI, and in particular under Maria Theresa since the tax reform of 1748 and the reform of the Central Board of Administration in 1749. The Austrian-Canadian historian Franz Chabot sees the first signs of Theresian and Josephinist church reform policy in 1750 when Pope Benedict XIV consented to impose taxes on the clergy in Austria for 5 years, after using such quinquennia for taxation of the clergy under Charles VI since 1731. In 1753, Kaunitz became chancellor in Vienna. In November 1753, he defined the outlines of church policy for the following years. The aim was taxation of the clergy, which was normally accepted from taxes, but also avoidance of a conflict with Rome. The Chancellor gave up this moderate course in the 1760s because of the indebtedness of the state as a result of the 7 Years' War, 1656 to 1763, but also because of the change of Pope from Benedict XIV to Clement XIII in 1758, although this change affected the relationship first in 1766. Now, Chancellor Kaunitz defined the principles of church policy in the way in which Joseph II, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and co-regent of his mother in the Austrian monarchy since 1765, found them in 1780. These principles continued until Joseph II's visit in Rome in 1784, after Pius VI's visit to Vienna in 1782. The main subjects of this church reform policy were repression of Baroque piety, foundation of new dioceses and new parishes by the state, regimentation and centralization of the education of future priests by state-controlled general seminaries, toleration for Protestants, believers of the Orthodox Eastern Church and Jews, and suppression of monasteries. Kaunitz remained Chancellor under Joseph II after 1780 and after the Emperor's death in 1790 until 1792. The reduction of monks and the first suppression of cloisters in Habsburg lands. In the 1760s, the first measures of state-run church reform began. Since 1762, the so-called reduction of monks had been planned. Since 1767, the number of novices who are allowed to enter a monastery or an order was limited by the state. The Austrian part of northern Italy, the Austrian Lombardy, became the first stage of the state-run church reform in 1766, when, after 1716, purchased ecclesiastical property was made taxable in the same way as secular property. Why Lombardy? Chancellor Kaunitz was responsible for the foreign policy of the Austrian monarchy. His chancellery at the Vienna Ballhausplatz, founded in 1742, was the foreign ministry of the Austrian monarchy. But in 1757, the Italian Council and the Netherlandish Council were incorporated in Kaunitz's chancellery. Therefore, since 1757, Chancellor Kaunitz was also responsible for internal politics in Austrian Lombardy and the chief of Karl Joseph von Firmian, the Governor-General of Lombardy, since 1756. In 1768, the Milan-based Economic Council, the Junta Economale, was founded. Since 1768, some monasteries were abolished in Lombardy. In his memorial Secret Instruction of 1768, Kaunitz gave the reasons for the measures. quotation, that all that not is established by God falls under the purview of a state, and that only what Jesus Christ has given to his apostles is to be understood as having been established by God. The sermon of the gospel, the Christian doctrine, the worship, the holy sacraments, and the discipline of the clergy, but the latter only in field of conscience. Quotation, end of quotation. In his German memorandum von der oberherrlichen Gewalt der römisch-katholischen Fürsten in Bezug auf die Religion und die Klerisei of 1769, Kaunitz said that monks were an invitation of the 3rd century and that considerable damages to state and church had been caused by them. Thus, it would be desirable if the state abolished monasticism or at least reduced it. The suppression of the Jesuits and the ex-Jesuit fund. The next step was the abolition of the Jesuits. In Portugal, the Prime Minister Marquis de Pombal opened the attack against the Jesuits of the Portuguese colony of Brazil after 1755. Some Jesuits were executed in Belém and Lisbon in 1759 and 1761. More than 1,000 Jesuits were arrested and deported to the Papal State from Portugal and its possessions in 1759. In France, the Parlement of Paris forced the king to suppress the Jesuits in France and its possessions in 1764. In Spain, King Charles III decreed in 1767 the expulsion of all Jesuits from Spain and the Spanish colonies. Naples, Sicily, and Parma in Italy, which were ruled by members of the Bourbon dynasty of France and Spain, followed this example in the following years. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV abolished the order of the Jesuits by the brief Dominus Accredemptor Noster for the whole Roman Catholic Church. By the abolition of the Jesuit property came at the disposal of the states, also in the Austrian monarchy. In the hereditary lands, more or less what is Austria nowadays, and in Bohemia, the proceeds from the secularized Jesuit property flowed into the ex-Jesuit fund, a state special account. Enlightened anti-monasticism in literature. The later 18th century saw quite a lot of anti-monastic pamphlets and booklets, like in France, Denis Diderot's La Religieuse, written in 1760, but published not before 1792, and many polemic brochures against the ecclesiastical principalities. The first wave of these flood of pamphlets against monks and monasteries began in Bavaria around 1760. The reform of censorship under Joseph II in 1781, and with suppression and secularization of monasteries that began in 1782, unleashed in Austria a second wave of these anti-monastic pamphlets or booklets and satirical or otherwise critical writing against monks and nuns. Since 1798, on the eve of the secularization in Germany of 1803, a third wave followed, again mainly in Bavaria. The anti-monastic publications ranged from juridical treatises on the right of the state to abolish monasteries and to dispose over their properties, to trivial, sensational literature, satirical poems, scandal stories, and satirical or critical novels. In the years 1782 and 1783, these brochures and pamphlets gave ovations to Jesuit II's suppression of cloisters. One of the most important of these Austrian booklets was the novel Faustin oder das philosophische Jahrhundert, published in 1783 and written by Johann Petzel, a Bavarian living in Vienna and Chancellor Kaunitz' private librarian since 1785. Another of these authors was the Westphalian canon Franz Wilhelm von Spiegel with his booklet Das Grab der Bettelmönche, published in 1782. Abolition and secularization of monasteries in the Austrian monarchy after the death of Maria Theresa. Maria Theresa died 29 November 1780. By Joseph II's decree of 12 January 1782, the abolition and secularization of monasteries began in the whole Austrian monarchy, from Belgium or the Austrian Netherlands to Transylvania, now the western part of Romania, and from the south of Poland to the north of Italy. Monks and nuns affected by this first wave of secularization in the Austrian monarchy were mendicants, especially some female mendicants and eremites. In May 1783, the second wave of secularization started, which led to the abolition of 700 to 800 monasteries in the whole Austrian monarchy until 1787. On the model of the ex-Jesuit fund of 1773 and the Milan-based Economic Council, the Geistliche Hofkommission in Vienna was organized in 1782. This government authority had to administrate the property of the secularized monasteries. As a department of the Geistliche Hofkommission in Vienna, the Commission for Abolition was responsible for the suppression and secularization of the monasteries. The proceeds of the secularized cloisters flowed into the religious fund of the Geistliche Hofkommission, which paid for the pensions of the former monks and nuns. The reasons for the secularization of monasteries under Joseph II. The reasons for the secularization of monasteries under Joseph II were the indebtedness of the state, economic utilitarianism. Monks and nuns did not seem to be useful for state and society. Enlightened principles and prejudices in general, concerned with the spread of state sovereignty over the church and the integration of the church into the state. For instance, by the prohibition of all direct contacts of monasteries with the masters of their orders in Rome in 1781. A main reason was the rejection of the monastic way of life according to the evangelical counsels: chastity, poverty, and obedience. This rejection stood behind Kaunitz's word of 1769, about the considerable damages to state and church which had been caused by monks and nuns, which I have quoted. Another reason was the foundation of new parishes and the using of the property of monasteries for the improvement of pastoral care. This point reminds of the 16th century Protestant princes who abolished cloisters and used their property for salary of Protestant pastors. This reason is not to be found in the German secularization of 1803. Secularization in Germany in 1803, the third point. There are two connections between the suppression of cloisters in Joseph II's Austria and the secularization in Germany in 1803. In some German states, the Milan-based Junta Economale of 1768, the ex-Jesuit Fund of 1773, and the Geistliche Hofkommission in Vienna of 1782 were models for the administration of the secularization of monasteries in 1803. The first connection was the execution of the abolition of cloisters, including the organization of the payment for the pensions for the former monks and nuns. The second connection were ideologic reasons, which stood behind the suppression of cloisters. There was a personal continuity of authors. For instance, Franz Wilhelm von Spiegel, the author of Das Grab der Bettelmönche of 1782, was the same person who recommended the secularization of monasteries in a memorandum of 1802, partly with the same words like in his booklet of 1781. And there was a continuity of arguments against monasteries and against monks and nuns, economic, utilitarianism, and the rejection of the monastic way of life in general. Immanuel Kant's idea of arrogated property. Above economic utilitarianism and above enlightened prejudices against the lifestyle following the evangelical councils, there was one leading argument. In Spiegel's words, in his booklet of 1782, this leading argument reads as follows: Die Nebel der Vorurteile haben sich in unserem Jahrhundert zerteilet. Die Macht des Aberglaubens verschwindet. Or, in English, the power of superstition disappears. It was the philosopher Immanuel Kant who wrote in 1797 in German, denn die Kirche ist ein bloß auf Glauben errichtetes Institut und wenn die Täuschung aus dieser Meinung verschwunden ist, so fällt auch die darauf gegründete furchtbare Gewalt des Klerus weg und der Staat bemächtigt sich mit vollem Recht des angemaßten Eigentums der Kirche. Or shortly in English, belief is the foundation of a church. If belief is removed by enlightenment of a people, the church has no longer property right. In this case, it is perfectly right for the state to take possession of the arrogated property of the church. This is the quotation of Immanuel Kant. This sentence was the leading argument for Joseph II's suppression of cloisters, and this argument stood behind the idea of the abolishment of monasteries and cloisters in Germany in 1803 too. The political case history of the German secularization of 1803. The origin of the German secularization of 1803 was not ideologic, but political. The French Revolutionary Wars, since France has declared war on Austria in 1792, and the Austro-Prussian campaign of 1792. In autumn of 1794, the French troops occupied the left bank of the Rhine. Treves, Koblenz, Bonn, Aix-la-Chapelle, Cologne, German cities and towns which remained a part of France until 1814. In 1795, King Frederick William II of Prussia signed at Bâle a separate peace with France. By this Treaty of Bâle, Prussia, as an important principality and electorate of the Holy Roman Empire, gave over the left bank of the Rhine to France, while the king reserved the right to demand a compensation. We remember the Peace of Westphalia on the right bank of the Rhine for Prussia's possession of the left bank of the Rhine, especially the Duchy of Cleves. Austria continued to carry on the war until the Peace of Campo Formio in 1797. The Emperor Francis II lost Lombardy and the Austrian Netherlands to France. He was forced to agree to the cession of the Austrian Breisgau on the right bank of the Rhine to the former Duke of Modena, his father-in-law, Ercole III of Este, and he demanded as compensation the secularization of the Archbishopric of Salzburg and the incorporation of its territory into Austria. The emperor was also forced in Campo Formio to agree to the cession of the left bank of the Rhine to France. The German princes, who suffered a loss of territory on the left bank of the Rhine, should get a compensation of the right bank of the Rhine. This compensation could only be by the secularization of ecclesiastical principalities on the right bank of the Rhine. The Congress of Rastatt should find a solution, but the negotiations failed in April 1799, while the war had begun again in autumn 1798. The Peace of Lunéville of 1801 and the concept of compensation for loss of territory. The war of the Second Coalition ended for Austria by the Peace of Lunéville in 1801 and for Britain by the Peace of Amiens in 1802. By the Peace of Lunéville of 9 February 1801, the cession of the left bank of the Rhine to France was confirmed. There was the Article 7 in the Treaty of Lunéville. This article demanded for the German secular princes who suffered a loss of territory on the left bank of the Rhine by the cession of this part of Germany to France, a compensation, in French, un dédommagement qui sera pris dans le sein du dit empire. The German princes began negotiation in Paris on these compensations, which could only be compensations by the secularization of ecclesiastical principalities and by the occupation of a majority of the imperial cities of the Holy Roman Empire. In October 1801, France, under Napoleon Bonaparte as the first consul, made a treaty of understanding with Russia, the other great power of that time on the European continent, to divide up the ecclesiastical principalities in Germany. Some months earlier, in August 1801, France had concluded an agreement on compensation by secularization with the Elector of Bavaria. Agreements with the Duke of Württemberg and the King of Prussia followed in May 1802. On 3rd June 1802, France and Russia signed an agreement of understanding about the secularization of the ecclesiastical principalities in Germany and the distribution of their territories under the German secular princes. The Reichsdeputationshauptschluss of 1803 and the secularization of ecclesiastical principalities. The Reichstag of the Holy Roman Empire at Regensburg appointed a special commission, a Reichsdeputation, for the purpose to fulfill Article 7 of the Treaty of Lunéville, compensation for the German secular princes who suffered a loss of territory on the left bank of the Rhine, and to divide the ecclesiastical principalities and the imperial cities. This special commission accepted the Franco-Russian agreement on 8 September 1802. After some negotiations and some modifications, the Commission passed this bill on 25 February 1803. This was the so-called Reichsdeputationshauptschluss, which was ratified by the Reichstag on 24 March 1803 and by the Emperor on 27 April 1803 as constitutional law of the Holy Roman Empire. This was the end of the ecclesiastical states. They were secularized and divided to the King of Hungary and Bohemia. This was the same person like the Emperor who secularized the bishoprics of Bressanone, Brixen, and Trento, the Elector of Bavaria, the King of Prussia, the King of Great Britain as Elector of Hanover, the Markgrave of Baden, the Duke of Württemberg, the Landgrave of Hesse-Darmstadt, and many other secular princes. The secularization of monasteries. But in 1803, in Germany there was not only the secularization of ecclesiastical principalities or ecclesiastical states, which was the secularization of political rights to rule over territories with its people. There was also the secularization of monasteries or cloisters and the expropriation of their property. The most important modification the Special Commission of the Reichstag made to the Franco-Russian plan was Article 35 of the Reichsdeputationshauptschluss. Article 35, as amended on 25 February 1803, reads, I quote, all property of religious foundations, abbeys and monasteries in the old as well as in the new possessions, Catholic as well as Protestant, be at all rulers' free disposition. End of quotation in English. Okay. The meaning of this article is that all secular princes who had suffered or who had not suffered a loss of territory on the left bank of the Rhine was allowed to secularize all monasteries in their new possessions, the secularized ecclesiastical principalities, and also in their old territories. This version of the article was a result of the pressure of Bavaria in the commission of the Reichstag. The electorate of Bavaria was heavily indebted Therefore, Count Montgelas, the Bavarian prime minister, wanted to expropriate the property of the wealthy abbeys of Upper Bavaria and Lower Bavaria. But not only the Elector of Bavaria took advantage of Article 35 of the Reichsdeputationshauptschluss and secularized the abbeys and monasteries. Almost all German secular princes, with some exceptions, from the King of Prussia to the last of the powerless little counts of the empire, with a countship of one castle and 2 or 3 villages, and without any loss of territory on the left bank of the Rhine, secularized hundreds of monasteries or the 1 or 2 cloisters in his little territory, and expropriated the property of the monasteries in 1803 or during the next years. The monks and nuns had to leave the convent buildings. They got a pension according to the demand in Article 64 of the Reichsdeputationshauptschluss. The buildings of the secularized monasteries were used as country houses or castles for the ruler's family, as military barracks, military depots, factories, prisons, lunatic asylums, or mental homes. The churches were often destroyed or pulled down, but sometimes used as parish churches. The farm buildings of the monasteries and the farming areas were leased, auctioned, sold, or transformed into princely domains. The forests of the monasteries are property of the German states, now the German Länder, still today. The archives came into the state archives. The libraries were partly sold and partly integrated into the prince's libraries. Nowadays, the state libraries, for instance, the Bavarian State Library in Munich. Conclusion. In Joseph II's Austrian monarchy, there was no secularization of ecclesiastical principalities, only secularization of monasteries or suppression of cloisters. Behind the suppression of cloisters under Joseph II stood a radical rejection of the monastic way of life according to the evangelical councils. But with the using of the property of secularized monasteries for the foundation of new parishes and for the improvement of pastoral care, the suppression of cloisters in Joseph II's Austria was really not so radical. The secularization of monasteries in Germany and in and after 1803 was much more radical. The reason of the expropriation of the property of the monasteries in 1803 was only budgetary policy and of heavily indebted princes or states. The connections between the suppression of cloisters in Joseph II's Austria and the secularization in Germany in 1803 were first and mainly the administration for or the execution of the abolition of cloisters, and second, ideologic reasons or arguments against monasteries and against monks and nuns, economic utilitarianism, and the rejection of the monastic way of life in general. Thank you very much. I have